Dapo, we can hear you. Can you hear us? Hi, Paul from Uganda. We're happy to have you here with us. Hi, Benjamin. Can everyone hear me? Fantastic, Benjamin. Thank you. Desiree from London. Welcome. We now have 94 participants. Hi, Desiree. Hi, Abby. Hello, I'm from Abuja. How's Abuja doing? Abuja is excellent, fantastic. We have 1 more minute to begin. We have 102 people, and then we'll start. Dapo, can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly. I can hear you perfectly well.
Thank you. Hi, Adobe from Slum to School. How are you today? How's Slum doing? Audrey? Okay, everyone. My time is saying 3:05, so we begin. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining Act Foundation this afternoon and morning, of course, in Liz's town of New Jersey or New York. We're so excited to have everyone here with us today. My name is Osai Alile. I'm the CEO of Act Foundation. And now we have 111 participants, so we're excited. It's going to be a fantastic conversation today with Mosun carrying the whole thing and keeping it straight with us. And we're so excited to have her here. So we're hosting this forum today, talking about the future of funding in Africa and engaging new donors and managing partnerships. Because we can see that things are going to slightly change. I actually said something yesterday, Mosun, and I said, look, the truth is that someone asked me a question, what's going to happen after this pandemic? And I wrote back, I have no idea. And the person sent me a message on the side, Madam, how can you say you have no idea? I said, I've never walked this journey before. I have no clue what's going to happen. The only thing I'm required to do is keep moving, be strong, and just believe that it's going to be better. And of course, put a lot of strategies in place to just enable me to move forward. So the truth is that we're not very certain exactly what's going to happen, but we need to be prepared just in case. And that's one of the reasons we're having this conversation today with you guys. So of course, we know that this has created and triggered a funding crisis across board for social enterprises and for NGOs and all of us that are doing this work together. But we believe that at least this will enable us, to come together, think through a process, understand where we're doing, create strategies, and help us to see who is out there and what can we do different. So today with me, I have 3 wonderful people, and I'm very excited to have them here with me. I'm going to start with Dapo. I have Dapo Oyewole, and I'll hand over to Mosun, who is the moderator for today. And then we have Liz Agbor-Tabi, and of course, my own personal person, the moderator, Mosun Layode, of course, of African Philanthropy Forum. So thank you everyone for coming, and we are looking forward to a fantastic conversation today. So I'm going to step back and allow Mosun to.
Thank you, Osai, for that energetic introduction. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I'm really excited to be here today to have this really important conversation that is pertinent to the survival of the social sector. As we know, the whole world is going through the same thing at the same time. And I like what Osai said in her introduction, which is, we don't know, no one has walked this journey before. Everyone is going through this at the same time. Countries, companies, communities, individuals have been impacted. And so how do we move forward? How do we go from where we are to where we ought to be? And today's conversation is really going to be around examining the global, the political economy and how it is rapidly changing and how the social sector can adapt to these changes and ensure that we remain relevant and we're not swept away that we survive and we remain sustainable, how we can cultivate new relationships, how we can manage the existing partnerships that we have. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation. The panelists and I have been speaking since yesterday, and we're very ready to go. Two exciting, wonderful panelists. I have Dapo Oyewole, who is a policy advisor and author, and believe it or not, he just wrote a book in the middle of this pandemic, 10 things African governments can learn from tackling the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we have Liz Agbor-Tabi, who is the Vice President for Global Policy and Government Affairs at Global Citizen. Both of them combined have a wealth of experience, and they've worked all around the world, in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, and in North America. So we're going to be hearing from them today. And to set the stage, I'm going to go straight in because we have 1 hour. But before we start, it's important that you note that we're going to be polling. It's important that we collect data and we know what you're thinking and have answers to some of the questions that will be useful to all of us on this call today, or in this webinar today. So at some point, 5 questions will pop up. All we need for you to say is yes or no. Thank you very much in advance for participating in this. So I'll just move straight on to Dapo to set the stage for us. So Dapo, you have such a deep wealth of experience in public policy. And I would like for you to start by giving us an overview of the political economy, how it is changing, and how it relates to funding in these rapidly changing times, and even in the near future.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mosun, and thanks very much to the whole team at the ACT Foundation for pulling together a very important conversation at a very pertinent time. Like you both said, we are living in unprecedented times, and we are very uncertain about what to do, what's coming next, and how to respond. I think at times when you don't know what's coming in the future, you have to look at what has happened in the past and try to look at the trends and the patterns. And the reality for all of us is that we have to bear in mind is that development doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens within a global stratosphere, a political environment. And our inability to understand that political environment will actually limit our ability to position ourselves and learn how to engage. So really, like you rightly said, the first important thing to do is to understand the political economy. Now, in many discussions, you will hear people tell you that aid is all about just charity and humanitarian support. Yes, a huge component of aid is about that. But the reality also is that aid is political. And even the countries that are giving aid themselves have their own domestic pressures, agendas, and their own foreign policy objectives. So when we're engaging in the aid and the funding sector, it's important to be able to, first of all, step back and understand what are the key drivers, what are the key motives, what are the outputs and results that some of these donors themselves would like to see. Secondly, it's important to look at their own domestic pressures and their own domestic economy as well. So in a scenario of protectionist, for example, the affinity of the taxpayers to use their money to be spent in powerful countries for their own development becomes limited. In the UK, for example, we know only too well that the media has been on top of the government to begin to rethink their role, the role the UK plays in foreign aid. And there was even a discussion about actually merging the Department for International Development and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which really is about development and foreign policy. So it's important to look at that. It's also important to look at some of the trade patterns, because in today's world, where there's a lot of rapprochement and quid pro quo, so to speak, you'll find that even if you're as a country, you are receiving aid from another country, there are expectations on your hand, either in terms of influence or political support on the global stage. You need to understand that dynamic as well. But I think what is really critical for the non-governmental sector is to also now begin to look at, now that COVID has happened, the countries that are the donors that have funds to spend are also facing constraints. They're also pressured, and their citizens are beginning to say, deal with the challenges at home before you fix the problems abroad. So in that regard, we need to be able to understand what kind of aid can we really engage? Now, one mistake a lot of people make is we look at aid in very, very broad terms. But the reality is that aid itself is very multifaceted. There's bilateral aid that comes from countries. There's multilateral aid that comes from institutions, and there's philanthropic aid that comes either from individuals and corporations. And of course, there's this corporate social responsibility, which you find from corporate entities. I think it's also important for organizations to be able to understand the different kind of aids and how they latch on. But let me just quickly, since we don't have time, illustrate 4 key things that I think that are absolutely critical for us to bear in mind as we think forward. And I'll call them what I call the 4 R's. First is the reconnaissance. We talked about it. You need to understand the environment. You need to understand the donor sphere. You need to understand what's driving the donors, their governments, or even if it's corporations, what is the agenda, what is the ideology, and what would they like to see? The second is really about looking at reassessment. Now that you've understood what the new agenda is, how do you begin to reassess yourself as an organization? How do you review your goals, your structures, your systems, your processes, and the kind of impacts that you need to make? The needs of people have changed, so organizations themselves need to change. We know that, for example, the next wave of focus for donor funding is really going to be around issues of health, economic cushions in terms of cushioning the impact of COVID-19, and also in developing human capital. So the question now is, how do we begin to reassess? And then the third one is actually about repositioning. How do you begin to now reposition yourself now that you know? And this is where we now start thinking of the necessity for innovation. The fact that you've been doing something one way before doesn't mean you can't do it in a different way. I think, for example, information technology and digital technology and all the virtues and values and opportunities it provides, perhaps maybe something that we have to lean on a whole lot more. Then also we talked about earlier on, myself and the team talked about the necessity for working in strategic partnerships. Now there's been, shall I say, a trust deficit between civil society and government. And this has been, in Africa, it's understandable because the history of civil society, particularly in Africa, is more really in fighting for democracy, fighting for government, fighting governments, fighting for transparency, and fighting for rights. But in the post-COVID era, when we all need to work together, we have to look at what are the opportunities for strategic partnerships with government. I work in government, and I can tell you one thing, government does not have all the answers. Government is actually looking for organizations that actually have value to add in helping them rethink their policy approaches and how they implement them. So how can your organization look for those opportunities and strategically align? Then also, I mean, when you're also thinking about repositioning, traditionally, most countries in Africa look to their colonial history for the sources of funding, aid, and support. But we live in a multipolar world today. Increasingly, you find countries like China, Russia, and Brazil and India are also becoming donors. There is a space for us to begin to think, should we really begin to look out at new partners and new alliances that could be required for us to be able to get the kind of funding that we need to support our own priorities. And quite importantly, in Africa, you see, as we say, charity begins at home. One of the key challenges that we still face is that Africa itself has not really pulled itself together to say, how do we come together and partner in terms of intra-African trade and South-South collaboration? What can we learn from each other? What value can we add to one another? Especially bearing in mind that a lot of the challenges we face are more similar than those who are actually funding us. And that's why at times we find a mismatch between what the donor wants to fund and what is a country's own priority. I think the last point I'll make is about then reflection. How do we now start thinking of an Africa post-COVID, but also an Africa post-aid? When do we start building our capacity as a continent to use our own resources to fund and fuel our own aspirations? The reality is that our reliance on aid has in a way created, shall I say, policy fatigue. We are not even think in a post-COVID era. One of the most important things for us to do as a continent or as organizations is begin to start thinking more strongly about the issues of self-sufficiency and sustainability. Without that, we will never have sovereignty. And without sovereignty, we will never have the capacity to be in the driving seat, to shape our own future, to determine our own priorities, and to respond to them as we see fit to shape the kind of future that we want for our continent. So I think if we look at those 4 R's, reconnaissance, understand your environment, reassessment, reassess your organization, reposition your organization in line with what you have reassessed, and then reflection. Start thinking, what do we do next? What scenario planning processes do you have in place that will help you know how to position both your funding model and both the structures and the systems that you have in place, not just for getting funding, but actually for delivering impact. And I think if our conversation dips deeper into that, we might be able to come up with some very helpful ideas to share with the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dapo. There's just so much to unpack there. And I think we're going to do that as we continue in the conversation. But I think we've set the stage perfectly, and you've laid the foundation for the conversation we're going to have today, which segues perfectly into Liz. Liz is particularly interesting because she has sat on both ends as a funder and as a grantee, and now working with Global Citizen, it's more like a hybrid. So she appreciates the pain points that nonprofits are going through, and knowing that we're at an inflection point, Liz, and the economic impact of COVID is telling. At the same time, we can see that there are projections that there's going to be an increase in global poverty. In fact, the highest since 1998. How does this impact nonprofits who typically rely on corporate, private, and family foundations for funding for social impact? And so it's a time where a lot of nonprofits are very uncertain and they are worried. So can you tell us, is it all doom and gloom, or are there opportunities out there that we can leverage, bearing in mind all that Dapo shared about looking at other alliances that we can form?
Thank you, Mosun, and thank you, Osai and the ACT Foundation, and Dapo, thank you for that segue. So first off, I'd like to preface this by saying how truly thankful I am that we're having this conversation. I think the broader conversation that we ought to be having is really how to develop a more resilient approach to funding our continent's development, fundraising, and managing key strategic partnerships agnostic of COVID-19. Admittedly, COVID-19 has been a catalyst for this dialogue, but these are things that we should be thinking about and considering far beyond the pandemic, because in reality, COVID-19 it is this time around, but who knows what the next global shock will be. And one thing that we do know with utmost certainty is not if there will be another global shock with similar or greater magnitude in our future, but rather what and when that will be. So we can't count on knowing this ahead of time and being able to plan and prepare for this. We can't plan on what the next event will be, the likelihood to cause utter turmoil, system disruption. But with that said, COVID-19 has created global turmoil. Lives have been lost, and the untold economic, political demise, the burden to fragile health systems and failing economies, fractured political systems. It's a really dire picture. So here's what we do know about what's currently happening. So COVID-19, as you suggested, is likely to cause the first increase in global poverty since 1988, reversing progress on health, nutrition security, education, with over 1 billion students who are now out of school. Oxfam warns warns that 500 million more people may be pushed into poverty as a result of COVID, unless urgent action on debt cancellation is taken. The Brookings Institute found that approximately 690 million people are likely to be in poor households in 2020. This is 50 million more people higher than the original estimates. And in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and North Africa, COVID-19 could cause up to 30 years of setback in development. And despite sub-Saharan Africa being hit less by the virus itself, the region will take the hardest impact in regard to extreme poverty. An estimated 23 million people out of 50 million of the people pushed into poverty will be in sub-Saharan Africa alone. So let's pause for a moment and digest all of this. One would say things are looking pretty bleak for the world right now, and for Africa specifically, and for organizations who depend on donor funding to address these issues. It's understandable that this is a worrisome time. Many donors are themselves facing constraints in cash flow and charitable resources. But I'm an eternal optimist, and I think there's actually encouraging news out there amidst the doom and the gloom. I know it's hard to believe that, but I really do think that there's good news. So for starters, for governments, while countries are turning inwards in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, and there's certainly been intensified nationalism rhetoric, and we're obviously in a global recession, but we don't yet know with certainty what the long-term impact on ODA flows will be. But what we have seen and what COVID has demonstrated to us is that defending this virus requires global cooperation and solidarity. And a threat anywhere in the world is a threat to us all. And because we all know that this virus does not respect borders, governments understand this. And so this leads me to believe that in the near term, we will see a return to ODA flows. For individual donors, the Fidelity charity conducted a recent study, and they took a look at individuals in US households who donate on average about $1,000 or more a year to charities. Admittedly, this was a pretty small sample size of only about 3,000 individuals, but I think it demonstrates some pretty promising data. And what that research found was that most donors plan to maintain or even increase the amounts that they donate to charities for this year and into Q1 of next year. It also showed that younger generations plan to step up their donations in greater numbers. About 46% of millennials say that they will give more in response to the pandemic. It showed that donors are concerned about the way that COVID could impact their access to health and human services. Related nonprofits are generally where donors are going to target their investments. However, donors are also concerned with other non-health related areas. And the research showed that 58% of donors are most likely to address domestic response efforts, but 11% are committed to addressing global response efforts, and then 20% are committed to addressing both global and domestic. And the research also showed that most donors do not plan to shift their giving to different organizations in light of the pandemic, and they'll try to stay the course and continue to support their favorite charities. For philanthropy, for foundations and family offices, we've seen that these organizations are changing the ways in which they're administering their grants to their partners and really trying to enable rapid access to funds, in some cases easing reporting requirements, and also partnering amongst themselves to form coalitions which allow for greater impact. For corporates, we're seeing a number of corporates involved in the response efforts. And this is out of a recognition that their workforce is their most vital asset and a need to invest in protecting that workforce. So in a nutshell, I think there's agency for humanitarian support and for organizations whose mission it is to address these challenges. So I would say that what's really critical for these organizations at this time is to be able to articulate their connection to these global challenges and to be able to pivot in some cases in ways which allows them to be able to uptake of these available resources.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Liz. I speak for all the nonprofits out there that this is comforting, but I also understand that it requires a lot of work. And I'm going to come back to you, especially as it relates to those who don't have a lot of donors at the moment and they don't have that access that some nonprofits have, who have to knock on new doors at a time like this, because most donors, as you have said, seem committed to supporting those they have always supported. What happens if you're just knocking on new doors? We'll come to that. I'll just move to Dapo briefly, especially as he spoke a lot about government and the opportunities in government. And you address the trust deficit between government and civil society, which is a very present truth that we have to deal with. But we're having a conversation before this, and you talked about the work that you're doing to ensure that there is a connection between government and civil society. Can you break that down and speak to the nonprofits that are here? How do we engage with government? How do we break down the barriers and create a bridge? How do we bridge that gap between government and civil society and tap into the opportunities there are in pooling resources from government, especially when we're talking about implementing initiatives at scale? I have known, I've noticed over the years, it's difficult to scale without government. So how do we do this in the nonprofit sector, that there is a relationship, a healthy relationship between government and nonprofits, and there isn't suspicion on both sides?
Sure, thank you very much. And thanks also to Liz for our intervention. I think she really framed the issues very well. You know, the relationship between government and civil society is very much like a bad marriage in a sense. You know, people love each other, but they just can't figure out how to communicate and collaborate. But they want the same things: happiness, togetherness. And that's what you see in government. I've had the privilege of I started my career in civil society. I used to be the head of the Center for Democracy and Development in the UK about 20 years ago or so, and then moved into government as an advisor to the Minister of National Planning and also the Minister of State for Finance, where donor coordination and engagement with civil society was my main portfolio. Then moved on to the private sector, working for McKinsey, which engagements with civil society also had another component. But now back in government as an advisor to the Speaker of the House of Representatives, we now see from, shall I say, an aerial view, the very clear fact that in many regards, what has actually happened between government and civil society is that the trust has been broken. And that happened historically, like I mentioned, right back from the days of the military. But in today's era, when we need to work together, when there is no other option but to look inward and hold hands to solve those problems, we need to sit around the table and find a solution. So some of the work we're doing, for example, is beginning to see how do we, in a constructive manner, bring in civil society to add their contributions, their perspectives, and their suggestions to policy processes. The reality at times is that civil society activists at times may feel that the way to engage government is to criticize or to cast aspersions on integrity and things of that nature. And there are times when that is required. But there are also times that if you are able to come with value, you have ideas, you have initiatives, you have projects and programs, or you have a different perspective on the policy, then there should be an avenue through which civil society can share that and it can be received. We must always remember, government is employed by the people. You know, there's always that thought that government is that sort of far-flung entity that you have to genuflect before. No, government works for you. but how we, shall I say, construct that conversation is important. I also think that for civil society particularly, there's a need to also now start rethinking what value do you really add and what products can you actually bring to the table. In a post-COVID economy, the needs are going to change. What new products, what new merchandise, what new services can you be able to deliver? And quite importantly, who is doing something similar? I think there are times there's a lot of pressure on NGOs to do something novel, do something unique, and claim ownership for it. When there are times there's no necessity to reinvent the wheel. What you really need to do is look for someone who's already doing something, look at the comparative advantage, and then come together, find how you can work together and to deliver. And then coming back to the issue of government, the reality is this: no matter how much people do not trust government, there is no entity in the country whose tentacles are as far spread and who has as much authority and control as government. So really, if NGOs do want to scale up the impact and the space that they have to impact people's lives, then they definitely have to look at how to work with governments. But then there's another conversation to be had, which is about to what extent are civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations in Africa collaborating with one another. You know, there's something in different parts of the world. In South Africa, civil society, you know, has a different pace and a different direction in East Africa, and the same in West Africa. An opportunity for non-governmental organizations to come together to say, in a post-COVID reality, how do we work together? I would love to see a Zoom conference organized, of course, by our friends at ACT, who can actually bring together leaders from civil society across the continent saying, okay, we understand the status quo. We know we're facing an existential challenge. How do we now collaborate and how can we do it together? I think there's a lot of space. The last thing I would say, and you may, I can refer you to my book, The 10 Lessons African Governments Must Learn from Tackling the COVID-19. I make a proposal and I say, when you're facing a public health emergency, there are 4 critical C's. First, you have to be able to have cohesion, meaning you have to work together, and I talked about that. I said there has to be coordination, meaning you have to have systems that help you to be able to coordinate your interests and find the best way to put those interests forward or to deliver value. And then I also mentioned the issue of collaboration, and I talked about that just now. But at the key, at the very core of it, and I remember in the beginning I talked about relationship. Every relationship is about communication. How do we communicate things much better, and how do we communicate both the value that non-governmental organizations have to add, how do we communicate the impact they're having, and how do we ensure that people understand what the sweet spots are, what the pain points are, what the opportunities are, and how we can particularly align. And I think if we're able to apply those 4 C's in this scenario as we face a global challenge, I think the opportunities for better strategic partnerships will increase, and also for greater collaboration. And it's very important to mention something, that at the end of the day, we think of aid mostly as cash. I would like to reiterate, at times it's not just cash. It could be technical assistance. It could be the availability of experts. So there are other things we need to think about aid or funding beyond cash. What are the different ways in which we could align a comparative positioning and value to work together to actually deliver? It's not, money doesn't solve every problem. Sometimes it's just partnership, collaboration, and innovation. And I think those are the key things that the post-COVID-19 has impressed on us. And I'll say one thing, this really, my friends, is the moment of reality for Africa. Africa now realizes that, yes, we've leaned on the rest of the world to shape our destiny, to drive our development for a long time. But like Osai said in the beginning, everyone is looking inwards now. And this is a time, a moment of reality when we also have to look inwards and ask ourselves, how do we work together? You know only too well that proverb that if you want to run far, also, how do they put it? I think it's something about if you run alone, or if you want to run far, you run together, or if you run alone, yeah, something like that. Yeah. But essentially, I think what I'm saying is that essentially we have to have the concept of Ubuntu, which is coming together, working together to shape the kind of Africa we want.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you very much. I like the togetherness that you just used, because that's my next question that is going to Liz. You know, this came upon us. We were warned, but it still came upon us. And it came upon us heavily and at the same time. But I'm super impressed with what Global Citizen has done. I'm part of an advisory group that they have set up for the physical concert that we would have heard, but stay tuned. We're going to tell you more about it. I'm so impressed with how quickly they were able to pivot, and they started the Together at Home campaign, which just spread around the globe like wildfire. And they were able to raise $128 million in a short space of time. Liz, can you share with us how you were able to pull that off? How are NGOs, how agile can they be? How nimble can they be? What do we need to be able to reassess and think of new ideas swiftly, not waste time doing it? And I know that it may be difficult for smaller nonprofits to achieve what Global Citizen did, but can you break it down for us at a smaller scale? How can our everyday nonprofits be able to do what you did, maybe in a different way? How do they cultivate partnerships? How do they knock on new doors? How are they able to sustain relationships and still make an impact in this time?
Thank you. So I spoke earlier about a need to pivot and reorient oneself as an organization to be able to partake of the resources that are available, especially in a time such as now. And I think that really speaks to the crux of where the challenge is for most of us. You know, my own organization, Global Citizen, recently had to pivot in light of COVID-19. Global Citizen is a movement of citizens around the world who are engaged and who are using their collective voice to end extreme poverty by 2030, in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. Last year, when we did some research, we found that it would require $350 billion to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Now, all of that has been disrupted as a result of COVID. And as I mentioned earlier, we're at risk of facing significant setbacks. So, you know, we are known for large events and in-person music festivals and convenings to address these Sustainable Development Goals and the challenges that most of the world faces. But you know, when COVID struck, we started to think about how we would be able to carry on with business as usual, given that most of the world was social distancing and isolating, and we would not be able to put on events in the way that we've typically traditionally done. And so we undertook a global campaign, which is Together at Home, and we initially started by leveraging our social media platforms to host artists in their homes, in their private studios, performing for our constituents and individuals who were at home. And that culminated in a broadcast on April 18th. And what we set out to do was to create a moment of global unity and solidarity through that broadcast and offer great entertainment to those at home, audiences who were practicing social distancing. And then we wanted to support the World Health Organization in its COVID response efforts. And we wanted to also commend the incredible acts of bravery of frontline workers at the center of the COVID-19 response. And so what we did was we hosted an event curated by Lady Gaga, hosted by the Jimmys, Jimmy Fallon, Jimmy Kimmel, and Stephen Colbert. And through 8 hours of coverage with more than 60 global broadcast networks across more than 175 countries, 9 digital streaming platforms, and hundreds of affiliates, we were able to reach billions across the globe. And through these efforts, we were able to mobilize $128 million, which benefited the world World Health Organization, and important regional COVID-19 responders across the globe. But that required us to be nimble, demonstrating agility and flexibility in ways that we hadn't been accustomed to before. We had to take what we had traditionally delivered as an through in-person venues onto a digital platform, which was new for us. And if you watched the broadcast, you'd note that many of the artists who participated in that broadcast recorded themselves with their iPhones. And so that was new for us, taking on production in a different way. And, you know, our efforts have been rewarding in terms of our ability to mobilize funds for our partners. We most recently were cited in the Guinness Book of World Record for the most money raised by a remote music festival. We raised $128 million. And for the most musical acts to perform at a remote music festival, we had 72 acts which were submitted remotely. And so I think, you know, I share this to demonstrate that the arc of possibility is endless. And organizations like ours have to be agile and prepare for thinking outside of the box, and also being able to communicate that clearly to donors and partners and sponsors, how you are pivoting and how you are embracing new operating realities. Right? And this communication needs to occur in real time. It needs to be frequent. And this needs to happen in times of peace as well as in times of turmoil, as we are currently facing. And what we found is that because we're able to communicate with our partners in a regular, clear, concise, consistent manner, that this helps to breed trust and empathy and support during times such as this. You know, you referenced earlier, I've sat on both sides of the table as a grantee and as a grantor. And one of the things that I always valued in my experiences was ensuring clarity in communication and being able to leverage that as a currency to build trust and empathy in times of difficulty. You know, my colleagues often laugh at me, and I was always the relationship manager who knew all of our grantees on a first name basis and knew their spouses, their children, their grandchildren, and everyone in their families, and was most likely to be invited to weddings and family events and meals in their homes. But you know, it's really important. And at times like this, it's important to cultivate those relationships, to really lean in and make it personal. It needs to be personal so that your sponsors and your funders can appreciate the difficulties that you're facing on the ground. Most funders don't have a true appreciation oftentimes of the realities on the ground. And you can be a force, really, an asset in helping to orient them to that. The other thing is that COVID-19 is largely perceived as a health challenge. But as I alluded to earlier, this has resulted in disruptions across multiple systems. And, you know, the impacts of this pandemic far exceed anything that we've experienced as in humanity, right? And so the socioeconomic impacts are significant. And so while an organization may not directly be working within the health space, this is a moment for you to understand your connection to the health sector, to understand the interdependencies across the multiple sectors that are required even for health security and health security resilience, and then to position yourself such that you can demonstrate a value add in addressing the challenges faced and in solutioning. And then finally, I would say it's really important now that organizations educate themselves on how funders are also pivoting. You know, I alluded earlier to the sort of shift in the dynamic in funder and grantee relationships, from less from a paternalistic holistic approach, which I think many of us can empathize with, having had an experience at one point or another with a funder that's been more paternalistic than we desired. But really understanding what the shifts are from the funder's perspectives as well, and then positioning yourself to be able to take advantage of that and to be able to leverage those shifts for the benefit of your organization. So I think those are, I'd love to share more pearls, and I know Mosun that you will speak more about that, but I think that those are some of the important considerations that organizations should have top of mind.
Thank you very much, Liz. I'm very mindful of time. I see that we're at 3:47 at the moment, and we still need to take questions. I have one quick question for both of you, and make it as brief as possible. We've talked about reaching out to government for support, mobilizing resources in the philanthropic community, and also looking to Asia and South America for support. What can nonprofits do at this time to internally generate funds? How can they be innovative so that they really are truly sustainable and not consistently dependent on grant? You know, to shift the percentage of grant versus internally generated funds from maybe 80 grants, 20 to internally generated funds, and flip it on its head. And while you're answering that question, I will just pitch this to Dapo because I know he's particularly passionate about that. Can you quickly chip in on Africa, supporting Africa, and how we can work together as a continent to raise funds for ourselves on the continent? So Dapo, you go.
Absolutely, and I might just even want to touch very briefly on some of the things Liz said, and I think she hit the nail on the head. You see, a lot of us, when we're engaging with donors, we think technically, you know, so we go in with our technical intelligence. We write these proposals that show how well we understand the terrain and things of that nature. But what Liz was trying to share earlier on is that you're still dealing with human beings. So you need to marry that technical intelligence with emotional intelligence. And that's how you build the relationship that create trust, that makes it possible for a donor to say, you know what, I want to work with these people. So I just wanted to touch on that. Then also in terms of language, I mentioned to you that I'd worked in the donor sector, government, and private sector. The interesting thing is everybody wants the same thing, but they're speaking different languages. I think we need to start moving towards a common language of communication that helps us to understand ourselves much better. And I think as we do that, we'll begin to realize that there are more opportunities for collaboration as opposed to confrontation. And I think that's something we need to build on much more. Now, particularly to your question about what can Africa do? Well, the reality is we're already on track. And the challenge in Africa often is that we have very good policies on paper, but how we implement them is all usually the challenge. I think on a at the level of regional organizations, particularly the regional economic communities, so talking about the African Union, SADC, ECOWAS, COMESA, IGAD, and the others, I think they all have some civil society councils, usually called ECOSOC. There is space, for example, for them to champion a cause whereby they all have a summit and say, look, government and civil society, we're both facing these problems at a regional level. How do we work with our own civil society to actually solve those problems? The reality is that, particularly for community-based organizations, they have more answers and solutions for you on their fingertips than the far-flung organizations that we're parachuting that may, yes, have the very best of intentions, but may not really understand what's happening on the ground. So we need to be able to do that. I think also in terms of governments, I think there needs to be a space where governments actually allow civil society to contribute a whole lot more. You asked me earlier on what we're doing in my current role. For example, there are two critical things we're doing. As you know, we're having to review the national budgets in Nigeria because of COVID-19. But what we've done in this instance is said, this is a budget for the people, not just a budget for the government. So we have invited civil society to make submissions and to engage and to share ideas. And one good thing I would say is the civil society group called the Open Alliance, which is like a coalition, they actually made the first step in terms of saying, we have constructive ideas to share, here they are, and they are actually working. The second thing is the legislative agenda, which is, shall I say, the manifesto of the current House of Representatives. We're reviewing the whole thing because COVID has changed the realities that the last one reflected on. The whole of last week, all we were doing was talking to civil society, saying, if your House of Representatives, you want to have key priorities that will address the challenges of the people, what should they be? How should we tackle them? And what processes should we follow? And the level of very constructive ideas that we've gotten from civil society has been very, very encouraging.
All right, thank you, Dapo.
You wanted to say something?
Yes, just to say that
Sure.
I want to jump in so that Liz can quickly chip in on this question. How can nonprofits be entrepreneurial and innovative such that they're financially sustainable? Unmute.
I'm sorry, I'll touch on that and on your earlier question as well. So I don't, first of all, think the conversation should be about limiting the reduction of dependency on aids and grants and foreign aid, right? I think philanthropy and foreign aid will always have a role in development, in Africa's development. Governments and the private sector simply can't go at it alone. And I think the conversation should really be about understanding the interdependencies across these systems, designing approaches from a resilience framework, which acknowledges possible system disruptions and embraces concepts of resourcefulness, flexibility, redundancy, and the ability to pivot when necessary. Now, in practical terms, what does that mean for nonprofits, right? It means, as I mentioned earlier, for those organizations that are not directly affiliated with healthcare, rethink the way you fit into systems resilience and leverage that to create an investment case for yourselves. It's relationship management, which is critical in times of peace and especially more so in times such as this. It's about making sure that you develop relationships, personal relationships. And then it's also looking at, with the rise in DRM, organizations needing to prepare themselves to be able to uptake of these domestic resources. You know, while benevolence and generosity are part of our DNA in Africa, I think I can't think of one person who's not caring for someone who's not part of their nuclear family, right? But access to the domestic resources is also going to require that organizations reorient themselves, whether that's in the areas of governance or reporting requirements. So it'll be important to address that. And then finally, this coalition of, this concept of coalition and strategic alliances is important. I know that many of our organizations, we really value staying in our own lanes and being the chiefs in our lanes. But what COVID has shown us is that partnerships, strategic partnerships and collaboration is necessary. It's also attractive to funders who often see this as the nexus for greatest impact and who also value the interdependencies across the various partners and how that creates increased dividends on their investments. So I think as organizations start to rethink and reorient and re-envision what the future looks like, it's important to keep these principles in consideration as you redesign.
Great, thank you very much, Liz. I think we should move straight to Q&A so we can hear from the audience and shed light on some areas that they may be interested in that we may not have covered. So there are lots of questions here. I think we have about 30
Did we do
questions.
a sequel? I'm offering this up to you, Osai, and the Ag Foundation.
Season two of this. So I'll just scroll through and quickly address.
Yeah.
I think
we should choose a few of the questions. Yeah.
Yes. There was a question around that popped up, and someone asked about faith-based organizations, that how do we engage faith-based organizations? And I'm throwing out these questions to both Liz and Dapo. Any one of you that feels capable should jump in around that, because indeed they have a role to play. And we know that some faith-based organizations actually have foundations, and they're closer to the communities and closer to the people. Who wants to take a dive at that?
I mean, I don't think the requirements for faith-based organizations are any different. These are humanitarian challenges that are impacting humans all over the world, and to greater disadvantage and disproportionately in some communities versus others. And I think faith-based organizations play a key role in bridging the gap where government, philanthropy, and civil society may not be able to address. And for communities, especially vulnerable and marginalized communities, faith-based organizations play a key role in being able to access these communities. So I would say that the same principles that apply for the nonprofits, as we've articulated here, would apply to faith-based organizations as well.
Great, thank you. Dapo, there are a few questions
I
around
completely
the 4
agree.
Rs.
Yeah, sure.
Great. Yeah, Dapo, can you quickly speak briefly to the 4 Rs? There are quite a number of questions around that. Some people didn't get them, and they just want you to speak a little more about them quickly.
Absolutely, and I'll just give you a quick overview. So essentially, the first point is reconnaissance. Do a reconnaissance in terms of understand the drivers, the motives, the ideology, the political pressures, and the political realities, the government from which the funds are coming from. You need to understand that to be able to know what to go for or what to leave behind, or even how to pitch and how to position. So it's important to do your reconnaissance and understand the playing field. The second is reassessment. Based on your reconnaissance of what may have changed in the donor sphere, how do you then begin to reassess your organization to shall I say, position and to pivot? You know, it's when you've done that reassessment, saying that, look, this is what is happening in our environment now, this is where we are, and these are some of the changes we need to make. So you need to do that reassessment. Then the third aspect is really then from reassessment, then you begin to say, how do you reposition? You understand what the scenario is. You know, you've done your SWOT analysis, you've done your scenario planning. How do you then reposition? What new partnerships, what new approaches, what new funding models, what innovation? Are you going to do more products? Are you going to do more services? Do you want to have more collaborative approach? Talked about, you need to start doing that. And do you want to even change the kind of funding you get and where it comes from and the kind of relationships that you had in the past? Those are things that help you to reposition. But the last R is reflection, which is the forward thinking, the future thinking that, okay, fine, we are dealing with a global pandemic. We need to address the short-term challenges. But then how do we deal with the long-term challenges? And this is where we need to start reflecting. And I think that reflection perhaps is not something that needs to just happen alone. I think organizations can do it individually, but I think there's a space for the non-profit sector, NGOs, civil society across Africa to actually do it collectively and saying, if we reflect on the challenges that we've just faced and the ones ahead of us, how do we begin to reposition ourselves? And I think when we see what happened during the Paris Declaration and the Accra Agenda, which is the international, because civil society was able to come together with the donors and say, we have our views, we have our priorities, we know how you want us to engage us. This is how. Well, this is our own agenda on the continent, and these are the bases on which we want you to partner. Mutual accountability, harmonization, and alignment. And I think when in a post-COVID world, it is important. The last thing I'll say is, and I want to agree with Liz, it's not all doom and gloom. As a matter of fact, I think this is an opportunity for us to have a global reset at the global level, regional level, but also at the national level. It is time to step back and reset how we function and how we work. And I do believe that if we use this moment of what I would call creative destruction to reshape and to redraw the architecture of development and aid, we actually might end up doing much better than we were doing before in terms of being able to access aid, but also in terms of how we're able to deploy and utilize aid to fuel and fund the development of our continent. But one thing we have to definitely keep in mind, and I think Liz may disagree with me slightly on this, is that we have to start thinking of an Africa without aid, or an Africa that does not have to rely on aid as the source of its own development, on external aid as a source of its development.
Thank you very much, Dapo. There are quite a few questions around collaboration. I see that there's some questions we already dealt with, because the questions were coming in as the conversation was going on. So we already dealt with some, but Osai, I think something that is clear is we might need to have another conversation around collaboration and how exactly to do that and what platforms are available to do that. But one question that jumps out to me, and I think it came up during the discussion, but we really didn't do a deep dive, is as it relates to small, wait, Osai. Sorry? Osai?
I totally agree with you, Mosun.
Great.
We also think through it while this conversation is.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think it's a burning issue on a lot of minds. Regarding smaller nonprofits, I'm seeing questions, or at least one or two questions here about small nonprofits that are unable to open new doors. There is a conception out there, a belief out there, which I don't subscribe to, because I know it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. But to be honest, there's some NGOs that do not know how to do this. Liz or Dapo, you can speak to this. How can small nonprofits become visible? How can they become attractive to donors? How can they open their new doors and not blue chip NGOs getting the funding all the time? Can one nonprofit in Ogbomoso or in Kafancha reach out to a donor and get funding? How can that happen?
Well, Shun, I'll return to my earlier comments around strategic partnerships and coalitions. And again, I think, to the extent that a smaller NGO is able to partner with perhaps a bigger or better established NGO, the power of those 2 or 3 NGOs coming together and being able to approach donors is increased, right? And so this is where I say it's not okay to stay in your own lane. This is where collaboration is key. The other thing that I think is really important for us to it goes back to communication, right? You're a small NGO, but how are you leveraging your communication outlets to gain visibility, right? And sometimes that's not just engaging your chief executives, but it's also engaging your beneficiaries, engaging and cultivating champions within your ecosystem that can speak on your behalf and can also help to elevate your profile. So I think there are many creative ways that we can approach this, but being small in itself is not necessarily a negative thing. Global Citizen, by the way, is, as far as organizations go in size, is a relatively small organization, but we happen to be a nimble and agile organization, and we're doing mighty things. And oftentimes we joke that we might be punching way above, but we're able to achieve and deliver. And so I share that to encourage the smaller organizations amongst us.
And if I can just add, yeah, absolutely. And it's just one very, very, very briefly, which is that at the end of the day, go with value, not with a begging bowl. I think increasingly, what tends to happen is, I get them all the time. There are letters of we need money, we're suffering, etc. But really, if I received a letter from an NGO that said, this is what we're doing, this is the impact we have already had, these are the products and services we can deliver, and this is how these products and services will help to achieve X, Y, Z. If the X, Y, Z is able to help me in my position to implement my expected output, I will get on the phone and call that NGO. So really, it's about, I mean, in a way, it's also about communication, like Liz said. It's really about how do you present yourself? Are you going to present yourself like the hundreds of thousands of other non-governmental organizations that are just asking for donations? Or are you going to sit down at a table and say, listen, I have something to offer, one, and secondly, I want to partner. And the reality is this: until you have value to add, you're never really a partner with the donor. The only time when a partnership occurs is when both parties bring something to the table. So I think NGOs also have to really think about how, you know, they also add value. And maybe I should also mention there are different ranges of aid, for example. So you can get funding of $10,000, $5,000. You can get funding of $50 to $100 or $200 million. To get the higher end of funding, there's a bidding process. And we probably need to have an entirely new, different seminar to actually talk about the technicalities of being able to bid for those larger projects that are implemented in your countries. The reality is that most African NGOs do not have the capacity to bid for those projects. Meanwhile, it's happening in their countries. So our heads cannot be shaven in our absence, so to speak. So we need to upscale our ability to actually engage and work with the larger NGOs that know how to win these bids, and then start positioning ourselves to say, you know what, we can actually bid and win. And then maybe we bring our international partners to also just work with us as part of a consortium. But that's a different conversation for another day.
Yeah. Great, thank you. We should be rounding up now. We got a bit more time, but we would like to close so that everyone can move on to their next appointments. There are 3 questions here that I want to touch on. One is around funding availability for nonprofits and CSOs in government budgets. Dapo, I don't know if that is the case. Someone is asking that question: how do you access that funding? Because they've tried and they've been unable to receive that funding. I'll reel out the 3 questions and we'll take them back to back so that we move on, or so that we round up. The last 2, there's a question around how do you maintain your focus in COVID times, and there's a lot of conversation or focus on pivoting at the moment. How do you do that without losing or changing your focus? And then the last one, we have a health question. There is a question around health foundations not being sexy, and they're at the bottom of the rung when it comes to funding. But I think that's about to change given all that we have going on. But the question is, how can this cycle be broken considering the level of health needs in Nigeria? So Dapo, I'll direct the question of funding availability in government to you. Liz, if you could answer the question, the last 2, how do you stay true to your focus as you pivot and not lose direction? And how can the cycle of the health foundations or health nonprofits being ignored be broken? Thank you. And we'll close the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Mosun, and I think that's a very good question. So first of all, and this is perhaps something we need to really focus on. There is no big civil society fund, so to speak, that civil society organizations can tap into. When I mean a big one, I mean a collective, comprehensive government fund. But I do think it's a conversation we need to start having, because at the end of the day, we're finding many organizations that are doing incredible work, either at the community level or at the local government level, or even at the state level, or even across the country. They are in dire straits, and some of them may tank. So there is a conversation to be had about how do we have a pool or a fund that civil society can actually compete for, access, and prove that they can actually use and implement. So again, I'll go to Osai and say perhaps ACT Foundation, maybe that's a conversation we can we can work together to try and curate and see how that's possible. But there are opportunities in different ministries, departments, and agencies, and that's dependent on the projects and the programs they're running. And in many cases, because of the communication challenges, which we talked about. Some of them may exist. And of course, it's only the friends and family of the people within the space that may get to know. So really, some of the things that civil society organizations that want to work with government have to do is they have to be, like I said, reconnaissance. They need to go in there, learn what are the programs, what are the projects, what are the priorities, and what are the pain points, and then come back and say, for this pain point you have, we have a solution. This is how we can help you, and this is how much we need to do so. The reality is that the silo, the walls between civil society, think tanks, consulting firms, international development firms, they're all crumbling. The skill sets that you need in all of them are increasingly becoming the same. So civil society organizations should not even just see themselves as people who just want to do good, but they should also see themselves as being able to provide that sort of technical, constructive approach to engaging. Then said two very important points is that you also have to build relationships. So you have to engage with the government. You have to go to the ministries and find champions. It is often said that the government has, government is bad, government is evil. But in the government, you find many people who really want to make a great impact and are looking for partners. Find your champion, work with them, find how you can add value, and I'm sure that there'll be a way to help you to be able to access those funds.
Thank you very much, Dapo. Liz, quickly,
Sure.
how do you stay true to your focus or vision, and how do health NGOs reposition?
Sure. So first off, I don't agree with the notion that health foundations aren't sexy. Until there's universal health care and access for all in the world, health will continue to be an important and critical challenge for us to address. Have faith that there will continue to be market demand for the services that health foundations provide. The second thing, the notion of staying true to your focus in many ways to me is akin to the nation of staying in one's lane and staying true to one's lane, right? And what we've seen is that in changing times such as now, again, flexibility is really a critical asset to have. And it's important, oftentimes within even healthcare, right now, the focus is on the COVID-19 and finding a virus, finding vaccines and therapeutics, right? But the reality is more people will die from malaria and polio and diarrhea and other GI infections than we will probably experience by the end of polio, right, of COVID-19. So if you're an organization that has been focused on malaria eradication, yes, you should stay true to your focus, in that your focus is the alleviation of health and disease burden. But I don't think that at a moment such as this, it would be prudent to focus exclusively on whatever that vertical or that specific disease that you were on. I just don't find that to be prudent from a business continuity standpoint. I don't find it to be responsive given the dire needs that the world has and the challenges that we face.
Thank you very much, Liz. Thank you, Dapo. I think we have we've spoken a lot. We can't exhaust the issues and the topics, and it would continue. We can continue this on social media, and the ACT Foundation will get back to us on the possibility of having another conversation around partnerships, which is really key. Thank you to all those who participated today. It's been lively on the chats. I can see that. We started with a little over 100 people, and we still have 141 people. Well done, everybody, for staying on. So much has come out today. This is recorded, and it was also live on YouTube, and I'm sure that we can still go back to this, and we'll see some of the comments and pick on some of the things that we missed. But the most important, I think, key takeaways, one is it is not all doom and gloom. There are opportunities out there, but we need to reposition and access funding by speaking the right language. We can't go speaking NGO speak when we're speaking with the corporates or when we're speaking with government. So let's reposition, let's reassess, and let's ensure that we're telling our stories appropriately, and we're taking advantage of all the opportunities we have and exposing ourselves to other networks that are available. And of course, building partnerships and collaborations is really key. And again, ACT we'll probably have another conversation around that. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dapo and Liz, for sharing your wealth of knowledge. ACT Foundation for providing this platform for your grantees and for across Africa, because I know people have joined us, not even from Africa alone, but from Asia and from Europe. And I think some people have signed on from the States. So thank you, and have a wonderful, I think it's a weekend, right? So yay.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it.
Wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mosun. I mean, I never can always. You are just it for me. Thank you so much. And Liz, you're my sister. And Dapo, thank you for your wealth of experience. We are so grateful to you guys today. And even for me, I've been like writing and typing and tweeting, and I'm really excited. And I'm so glad that everybody's still very positive. Someone said, we did the poll, says, do you think your organization can survive post-COVID-19 crisis? 83% say yes. So I'm so glad that we're still very positive and we're still on this journey to make the world even a better place. So I'm looking forward to the next webinar, and I'm hoping that we even have you guys join us as well some other time in the future. Wishing everyone the very best, fantastic weekend, and stay completely safe. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you to our over 170 guests today. We're very grateful for. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Enjoy.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. Yeah, I must always dance.